Ok, buonasera a tutti e benvenuti. For the first and probably last time, we're actually ahead of schedule. So we're going to make the most of it. Well, we made it. Each and every one of you is very, very welcome indeed. And each and every one of you has a story, or maybe multiple stories, to tell about how you got here, what brought you here, and what you are hoping to see, hear, and take away from here. Indeed, some will arrive later and tomorrow with stories about why they are not yet here. And what a rich and diverse gathering you collectively make. The final count of nations represented here in one form or another stands at 55, and we covered nearly every letter of the alphabet. Admittedly, we had to do a little creative thinking to get Q, so we are grateful for those with experiences from Quebec, although we did not count this as one of the 55, you'll be pleased to hear. We could not stretch the fact that many of you changed flights in Qatar. We are also grateful to Father Fadier for coming from Wallonia, although again we didn't count it, even if he does originate some time back from Chicago. Thank you, Tina Beattie, for being born in Zambia, which covered the tricky Z. As far as I am aware, however, one remaining gap stands with X, and there is no country which has a name beginning with X. But should anyone have travelled from the ancient city of Xanadu in China or Xinguara in Brazil, please let me know and we'll make it an honorary state for the duration. We deliberately set out to bring as many people as possible to this conversation table from around outside the confines of Europe and North America. We equally wish to bring as many emerging scholars as possible to have their voices heard. You are the people who will have to deliver in the long term on ensuring the pathways for dialogue for this century become fruitful ones that are free of obstacles. Best to get you involved in that work as early as possible. There are no free lunches when it comes to progress in ecumenical and interfaith relations. So the time has come to help an older generation move beyond the logjam and lethargy of recent times by looking back and looking forward alike, by learning from the pathways of dialogue in the past, placing present initiatives under differing forms of scrutiny to better understand what methods and means of promoting dialogue are proving fruitful, and those which are not, and finally, and of a special significance, looking to the future. And this future, not just in abstract terms of what might come to pass, but crucially in helping to ensure that positive developments and initiatives do come to pass. This is another important reason why this gathering will also seek to engage the younger and emerging generation of ecumenists as fully as possible, to ensure that their voices and experiences are heard and that they in turn are better supported, facilitated and prepared to take up the torch of dialogue into the future in a more energised and positive direction. Some good souls who should be here, alas, cannot join us, many through ill health or that of loved ones. Please remember them and their families in your thoughts and your prayers. A special mention in particular for Paul Collins, who was part of the organising committee, who unfortunately cannot be with us this week. You are going to hear many, many wonderful stories about Saints Francis and Clare over the coming days, as well as visiting many of the most important and sacred sites associated with them. So I may as well get my turn in early. The well-known story of St. Francis and the wolf of Gubbio is considered enchanting by so many people. The wolf, feared by the villagers, is tamed by Francis with the promise of food and good treatment. Carlo Corretto's short book, I, Francis, contains a series of imaginary monologues from St. Francis, as though he were addressing the modern world. There is a very interesting passage about the wolf of Gubbio. It goes like this. Francis is speaking about human beings, and he says, "It is they and they alone who are responsible for the problem of violence. In fact, they are the only creature in the universe that causes any problems at all." Francis then asks, "Why are you so interested in the little story of the wolf of Gubbio? It interests you so much, and yet it makes you smile. You do not really believe it. In that little story, you see the solution to the problems troubling you. Yet, at the same time, you relegate it to the category of the utopias, a wolf tamed with a caress. And yet, I have told you, the miracle of that morning in Gubbio was not the conversion of the wolf. It was the conversion of the people who lived in Gubbio, who for a fleeting instant believed it was possible to overcome a wolf armed only with food to give him, instead of weapons to bloody him. Here you have the secret of everything. Here is the absolutely basic secret, hidden in God's whole plan for humanity. To believe in the possibility of the impossible. To hope in things against all hope. To love what does not seem lovable. God's proposition to humanity is always wrapped in the veil of this mystery, and this is always the sum and substance of God's request. Can you believe? Can you hope? Can you love? If you tell me yes, I shall give you the gift impossible. All of you gathered here in this very special place this week have already demonstrated that you have great hope, that in many ways pertaining to faith and life, you believe in the possibility of the impossible, that love can overcome differences and division. Many of you arrived here by train, most of you in fact, winding your way through the hills and mountainous splendour that is the terrain of Umbria. Your imaginations will no doubt have been captured. In this beautiful and inspiring place, these next few days, the landscape itself will inspire and provoke you much further. Looking across the landscape, the wondrous horizon can appear to stretch on and change momentarily depending on your vantage point. Our gathering this week is about looking beyond the contemporary ecumenical and interreligious horizon, seeking understanding, sharing differing perspectives, looking beyond the narrow and confined viewpoints that remain divisive, being inspired by ongoing conversations from at least 55 different countries and many more differing contexts and faith communities. So, our default modus operandi for this gathering is thinking outside the box. What might this mean? It's important to stress that this does not mean jettisoning the past or rejecting or neglecting other forms of dialogue and ecumenical and interfaith achievement. Far, far from it. Here at Assisi2012, we do not only wish to encourage innovation, but also to learn from the best of the past. Therefore, during our gathering, we will seek to revisit, learn from, renew, and adapt some of the methodologies employed to great effect in dialogical conversations in the past. We wish to learn from and encourage dialogue from below and from the margins as much as from the institutions and communities pursuing and promoting dialogue in more formal ways. In all, we hope to discuss, to enhance, and to promote the science of bridge building for our contemporary communities and for their shared tomorrows. So, in answer to the question, what sort of dialogue are we engaging in here then? In truth, it will be at multiple levels. We all know, of course, that there has been much discourse about dialogue at the official level by formal bodies and committees and institutions, just as there has been much literature about grassroots initiatives and collaboration. What there is relatively little attention to at present, however, is how a bridge might be made between those two levels of dialogue. Well, you, the good folk of Assisi2012, are an experiment in building such a bridge. Let me explain a little further. Nobody is here as an official delegate, only our gracious hosts, Archbishop Sorrentino, and the custodians of the various wonderful Franciscan and Clarissan houses and churches here in Assisi are here, so to speak, acting in official capacity. And even they, we hope, will join us in letting their hair down and enjoying a conversation by stepping out of official persona during these days at times. What we will be engaged in here is something necessarily different from, but complementary to official processes of dialogue between churches and faiths. I want to draw an analogy here with processes of diplomacy in situations of conflict in the political realm. A framework in recent years has been developed which delineates between different processes and practitioners in such diplomacy and situations of conflict and tension. It is called the Tracks of Diplomacy Framework. A recent study and survey of the distinctive forms of such diplomacy helps illustrate the nuanced distinctions and areas of focus that these differing forms take on. In particular, they help show that the dividing lines between official and non-official diplomacy is no longer as clearly demarcated as once believed, that such a dividing line is, in effect, or at least should be, not so rigid. I really believe the ecumenical and interfaith efforts for our times can learn much from this. So I wish to share with you a passage from and some definitions from that study of diplomatic processes, and I quote, "Peaceful resolution of international conflict is the objective of both official and unofficial diplomacy. The distinction between track 1 and track 2 diplomacy captures the idea that these are parallel forms of intervention. Track 1 practitioners are foreign service professionals who primarily implement the policies of their governments. They are representatives of the state. Track 2 practitioners, on the other hand, are citizens from a variety of sectors who consult with parties on all sides of a dispute. They are non-state actors. These practices have developed separately, as have the corresponding academic specialities of diplomacy and international conflict resolution, or ICR. In more recent years, the practices have, at least to some extent, converged. Official and unofficial practitioners often work together on the same conflict. Recognizing this development, several international conflict resolution scholars have noticed a new type of practice emerging, where the tracks meet. Others have suggested ways to connect the activities of the tracks within the same negotiation process, or within official diplomatic institutions and cultures. As a result, the idea of a track that bridges official and unofficial activities has been proposed. It is referred to as track 1.5. This emerging ICR practice is defined by NAN as unofficial interveners working with official representatives of the conflict parties. We do not wish Assisi2012 to be seen as an event where differing factions and competing interest groups come together merely to rehearse overtly familiar arguments about lines in the sand that divide people of differing faith communities today. Therefore, formal scripts will not be required or desired at this event. That is why it is so especially significant that, with the exception of our gracious hosts, all participants, bar none, have been invited to our gathering in their capacity as private individuals, i.e. not as representatives and spokespersons of particular churches, traditions, and organisations. So we have our own framework. We will look at the ongoing causes of division. We will then explore sources and features of commonality, and through engaging in a qualitative comparison of the significance of the two, set our hearts and minds towards re-energising the ecumenical cause through resolutely pushing our thinking outside the box to new levels. On each day, we also divide into 3 thematic areas of focus: exploring intra- and inter-church issues, second, exploring interfaith issues, and finally, looking at issues pertaining to the relations between faith communities and the wider world in which they must live out their faith. In all of this, our gathering will partly involve what we might call track 2 ecumenism, and perhaps to a much greater extent what we could term track 1.5, 1.5 ecumenism. What we are engaged in, and what we hope each of you will continue to energise when you leave at the end of the week, is an intermediate stage or process towards goals that are not yet defined in finally explicit terms, beyond the seeking of greater understanding, peace, and harmony. The most pressing challenge today is how the differing strands of ecumenical and interfaith endeavour can be brought together. We wish this event to be something very different to a traditional conference. The overall aim of our gathering is to discern new ways, means, and methods of advancing the dialogical cause, and with renewed energy for a new century. We wish Assisi2012 to be something truly transformative of the perspectives, the methods, and approaches to dialogue that every participant holds. Our aim is to reignite the ecumenical flame in a positive fashion that will allow the cause to gather renewed momentum for these times. And as I have reached 15 minutes exactly, I am going to finish. So a gathering of this nature and on this scale and in such a wonderful place does not happen by itself, of course. So I want to introduce you to some very special people who have worked tirelessly to make this gathering happen, your organising committee. As well as giving you and I a chance to express our public appreciation, I also wish them all to express for us their one earnest hope for our gathering throughout these coming days. When they have all finished, we will give them a very big round of applause. But first of all, let's delve deep into matters of hope. So I introduce to you first Justine Gonzalez.
Hello. Justine Gonzalez, University of San Diego. My hope for the gathering is for smooth sailing. I hope that your stay in Assisi will be fruitful, peaceful, and above all, comfortable. And if not, please come find me and I'll try and fix it.
Thank you, Justine. Gioacchino Campesi.
Hello, good evening. My hope is that the gospel spirit, the spirit of humility, the spirit of poverty of two giants of our Christian tradition, such as Chiara and Francesco, will inspire us during these days.
Grazie, Gioacchino. Mark Chapman.
Hi, and welcome to Assisi on behalf of the organising committee. And every year we've tried to hold an international gathering for the ecclesiological investigations, and we always like to choose a historic city. So last year we were in Dayton, Ohio, which I think gave cash registers to the world. This year we're in Assisi, which gave two great saints to the world. And my serious hope for the few days we're going to spend together is that we'll be able to talk with one another and have conversations with one another and really to build friendships with one another in that spirit of humility that we'll be able to take forward into the future. So we'll talk, we'll enter into new sorts of friendships in order to further that ecumenical spirit into the future.
Thanks very much, Mark. Mary McClintock-Fulkerson.
Hello. Wish I could have a hope and a half. Oh.
You can.
No. We believe in a God of overwhelming love, and I had my hope is going to come from a comment, a non-religious person, a colleague of mine at Duke who was involved in grassroots organizing. We were working on that together, and he said to me, what really impresses me about Christianity, and I don't want to be religious, he said, is the generosity. And he put it very articulately, because of course we believe in a generous, loving God, and we want to be generous, but he put it very specifically in terms of the call to receive from the other. And I've never forgotten that, because it's a different twist than I should love my neighbor and be nice to my neighbor. It's about honoring those who are other and different and recognizing I need to receive from those who are different. So that's my hope, that we can have overflowing, abundant experiences as we receive from one another, especially those of us who have had very different lives and experiences.
Thanks very much, Mary. Miriam Howe.
During this gathering, we will experience both synergy and serendipity. So I wish that we can make the best use of it and through it be inspired to leave well-trodden path and breach new ground.
Thank you, Miriam. Vladimir Latinovic.
I come from a country where we have very cold winters, and I can tell you that there are a lot of ways to survive the cold winter month. One of them is to stay active the whole time, and another one is to stay close together. We are doing both this year. And my hope is that this will help us to survive the ecumenical winter. And if we keep doing this kind of stuff, I'm sure that the ecumenical spring will come soon.
Sandra Mazzalini. Thank you, Vladimir.
Welcome to Italy, but especially welcome to Assisi, the land of Francis and Clare. My hope for all of us is that the beauty and the spirituality of these places wrap around us in these days. These places remind us what is essential in Christian life. So, I hope that this essentiality helps us to put all our world views, even religious one, back into their right perspective, because they can sometimes be an actual hindrance, which makes it difficult for us to form sincere relationships. It is a great pleasure to reiterate my welcome to Assisi.
Grazie mille, Sandra. Giovanni Ponigotto.
Okay, just not many words. This is an international meeting, but my hope is for all of us, and above all for Italian, European people and theologians. My hope is that this conference could be a sign for reconciliation and for also Italian, European, of course, global theological, a more profound tentative to go ahead in thinking and living theological aspects. Thank you.
Grazie, Giovanni. As our other committee members were speaking, I was scanning the room trying to look for Peter Fan, and then I was overcome with fear. I thought he'd been nabbed by the Spanish Inquisition coming over from the Basilica. But I see he's made it, so he's here. Peter Fan.
The great thing to be the last speaker, because I'd like to inform you that all the hopes have been fulfilled. I like to hope what Archbishop mentioned in the sermon this evening, that the Holy Spirit be with us in these few days. It is through the Spirit of love and freedom, that we will truly dwell in common, the title of our conference, in spite of the real differences that still divide us. So we'll be hopefully be enabled, inflamed by the Holy Spirit, the spirit of unity, the spirit of love, and the spirit of freedom. Thank you, Archbishop, for the idea this evening.
Thank you, Peter. And that is our wonderful committee. There is one person from the locality here of Assisi we also want to come up and express a hope, who has been of great help to us in organising the gathering, Friar Brian Terry of the Society of the Atonement.
Well, if you know anything about Franciscan spirituality, it's about telling the story. And today we were at the Porziuncola, and while they talked about that wonderful place that Francis rebuilt, it was also his most famous place that he liked. He really liked that spot, maybe because it was small or intimate or whatever. So when he was dying, he asked to be carried through the city one last time to see everything, and then to be placed naked on the ground there, to return to God the way he came. But he didn't leave the planet without saying to the friars, Up to now, brothers, we have done very little, so let us begin. So, it is my prayer that this time is transformative. This is community of God, a thanksgiving community. That it is a place where we're not the past, but we are future. That we are transforming who we are to be more and more future. And that we can live that fullness in gratitude.
Thank you very much, Father Brian. So these are all people, if you think your email inboxes have been full because of Assisi2012, these people you have magnified it by 1,000-fold. Please join me in showing your deep appreciation to each and every one of them. Thank you also very much, each and every one of you, and many others have also helped enormously to bring us to this point. And later in the week, I will try to make space to thank them all publicly as well. But now we turn, as we continue our theme of the power of hope, to hear an expression of hope for our gathering from three prominent voices who call Italy home. They will share for us some thoughts on the significance of Assisi2012 in general and their particular hopes for its impact on the Italian context. So I ask to join me on the stage, first Professor Sandra Mazzolini of the Pontifical University Urbaniana, Rome, and a member, as you've seen, of the Assisi2012 Organising Committee. Next, Friar Pasqualino Massoni, also of Italy, the director here of our venue, Domus Pacis. And finally, Professor Roberto Repele, the chair of the Italian Association of Theologians. Please give them a very big round of applause.
We have crossed many borders to come here to Assisi. Assisi is for us an ideal border area. But what happens when different people cross borders and encounter new cultural and religious worlds? Border areas are the first places where intercultural exchanges and mixing occur. The people who inhabit borders know that such exchanges and mixing are the result of ongoing and often difficult processes of integration. They require time and reciprocal effort. But when a cultural or ethnic majority adopts, for whatever reason, an attitude of closure or even of violent oppression of minorities, then the border is no longer the space for meeting others, nor for reciprocal enrichment. It becomes a space for conflict. However, the border is a very significant category in a symbolic way too. From this point of view, the question about the right way to come to terms with the border, if I can say so, is not secondary. I think that friendship is a fundamental value for understanding the border as the space of an enriching encounter with others. According to the Bible, friendship is an activity of mutual improvement and a meeting face-to-face that indicates proximity and intimate and honest relations. It is also a bond of affection that entails responsibilities and benefits and implies sharing. The Bible uses this category to express the relation between God and humankind. Jesus says, "I have called you friends because I have told you everything I have heard from my father. Friendship implies mutual knowledge and enrichment, which are based on the self-consciousness that each person has of its own identity, and how she presents and expresses him herself. So, friendship requires both a real attitude of setting aside prejudices and skills to listen to the others, as well as to share one's own life, worldview, etc. I hope that our meeting is shaped by friendship and its implications. I don't know what is the actual meaning of our meeting for the Italian context. The theological Italian context is well represented by Father Roberto Repole, who is the chair of the ATI, the Theological Italian Association. He can explain better than me the actual meaning which our meeting has with reference to Italian context. I can only say that my hope is that our meeting is a real sign of the universality of theology, dialogue, interculturality, etc. The Italian theology needs to widen its perspectives, because in Italy, theological studies are, first of all, a stage of the training for future priests or an obligatory step for an ecclesiastical career. Many Italian lay people study theology, but they have few opportunities to teach theology or to put into practice their theological skills. In conclusion, I reiterate my hope that friendship shapes our meeting in Assisi. All of us have left something. From now on, we have the opportunity to establish a sincere and loyal mutual knowledge, which I hope will favor mutual growth. So, welcome and have a good time in Assisi.
Grazie, Sandra. And now, Fra Pasqualino.
My name is Brother Pasqualino, and I live here in this house. I welcome you in this residence constructed specifically to welcome pilgrims to these holy places. Right away, I ask your pardon for certain discomfort you may have to put up with, for my English too. But I am hoping that the grace that pervades Assisi may overcome our limits. In welcoming you here, I want to make a wish. I would first of all want to introduce myself in terms of my faith. I am a friar minor of the family of St. Francis of Assisi and a Catholic priest. As far as my vocation is concerned, as Lord Francis loved to say, I belong to the world. As far as my heart is concerned, I belong to the Lord Jesus. It is exactly for this reason that I dare to express the hope that in these days and in your encounters, you will find this a place of grace. In my life, I have experienced with wonder unexpected meetings which were filled with the grace of the Lord. No doubt through my indifference or lack of collaboration with God's projects. It's true. I have missed out on some of these. However, I have understood that God waits for us in unexpected and unforeseeable circumstances, but above all in our daily lives, where we take seriously our personal responsibilities. I wish, therefore, that you may arrive here as Peter, Andrew, James, and John, who left home hoping to find good fishing, unaware that they were being awaited by someone who would call them by name from the edge of the lake to become witnesses to his death and resurrection and to create a community of believers. I hope that you too, having come from all over the world, may be called by name and filled with the dignity of children of God. May you be instruments of the Lord Jesus in reconstructing the unity of a church that bears witness to the resurrected Lord and points the way to the reality of heaven. May the Lord bless you. Thank you.
Grazie mille, Father Pasqualino. And last and certainly not least, Professor Roberto Repoli.
Good evening. Dear colleagues and friends, first of all, I must apologize for my poor English. In spite of this, I'm glad to be here and very grateful for the invitation to take part in this important meeting. I thank the organizers on behalf of the Italian Theological Association, an association born soon after the Council Vatican II, which, as we all know, has contributed so much in renewing the theological thinking over the Church, has opened to ecumenism, and has given a strong contribution to the building of peace. All things that in one way or another are the subject of our conference. Therefore, it is with great pleasure that I warmly wish the organizers of the conference and all the participants a few days of serene and fruitful reflection. It seems to me particularly important that Christians today should reflect upon the contribution they can give to peace and reconciliation, and how deeply that search for peace and reconciliation should affect their hearts and involve them in pursuing unity, together with all men of goodwill and with all those people who belong to the other religions. The Church is, in fact, the sacrament of unity and pacification. The Church exists to announce in the world and to the world that God's great project of salvation is a project of communion between mankind and God, and a consequence of communion among nations and people. And since God's project must take place in a mankind marked with sin and in need of reconciliation and peace, the Church is also the sacrament of the gift of peace and reconcilement that God has offered us. Therefore, the involvement in building up peace and promoting all those human realities that are engaged to heal the wounds of conflicts and support peace among men is a task that quite naturally affects our churches and all Christians. But we all know quite well that our efforts towards peace and reconciliation on the one hand, and the division inside the Church on the other hand, are two facts that seem to elude each other. The fully significant sign of God's redeeming project cannot be but a universal and fully reconciled Church. For that reason, I think, it is so important that we are engaged in a theological reflection, aiming at finding out new ways towards peace and reconciliation. At the same time, as we consider the steps we have moved towards ecumenism, how far we have gone, how further we have to go, in the certainty that the Lord, who has revealed himself as the God of peace and mercy, cannot but wish that his church should find its way towards reconciliation and unity. Thanking you all again for your kind invitation, I wish all participants that our common reflection in the course of this meeting may be a significant contribution given by theology to the Church, so that the Church itself may keep on being faithful to its vocation, even in our days, which are so complex but also so stimulating. Thank you.
Grazie mille, Professor Repoli, grazie a tutti. Grazie. So you will have seen so far exemplary instances of how people can be crisp, succinct, and on time. We've started well. I hope we continue in that vein. Our gathering's opening plenary lecture tonight comes from a most distinguished scholar practitioner from the world of peace building, reconciliation, and conflict resolution. He was so very obliging in being willing to come and speak at Assisi2012 that he actually arrived quite early for our gathering, to be precise, 1 year early. But I will not go into detail right now about the urgent phone call I received from Italy back in April 2011. I will let our distinguished speaker share those stories with you himself, should he so choose, over something a little stronger later this evening. But we are so very, very glad that we have him with us, and that he has the right audience second time around. Paul Arthur is the Emeritus Professor of Politics and Director of the Graduate Programme in Peace and Conflict Studies at the University of Ulster. He holds a BA and MSSC from Queen's University Belfast and a D.Lit from the National University of Ireland. He is the author of 5 books, including Special Relationships, Britain, Ireland, and the Northern Ireland Problem, 2001, and around 70 peer-reviewed articles. Paul's study of how peace was achieved in Northern Ireland, special relationships, is based on his own lifetime work from the early days of People's Democracy, on which he is the internationally recognised expert, to his involvement in the confidential political meetings leading up to the Good Friday Agreement. Paul's book charts the development of constructive diplomacy between Britain and Ireland, which eventually led Northern Ireland politicians to move beyond what seemed a truly insurmountable impasse. Paul has acted in a consultancy capacity for the United Nations Research Institute in Social Development on Political Violence, and for the Northern Ireland Affairs Committee at the House of Commons on an inquiry in dealing with the past. He has advised the Carnegie Commission on Preventing Conflict, the official Savile inquiry into Bloody Sunday, the executive of the British Irish Association, and the World Bank for the World Development Report in 2010, among others. He's been involved in many problem-solving workshops in Colombia, Guatemala, Sri Lanka, Palestine, and Macedonia. Recently, he has also been involved in background discussions with the Prime Minister of Sri Lanka and delegates from Georgia, Iraq, and Israel-Palestine when they have visited Northern Ireland. Since 1990, he has participated in many Track 2 initiatives with Northern Ireland's political parties in Europe, the United States, and South Africa. He serves on a number of international advisory boards, including the Project on Justice in Times of Transition in Boston, Fusion in Bogota, the Global Majority in Monterey, California, and the William Jefferson Clinton Institute in Dublin. But Paul also has particular expertise at showing the importance of grassroots people and initiatives in bringing about peace. One particularly striking phrase from his keynote public lecture at the Kroc School of Peace Studies in San Diego in 2010 struck me so very much I had to go to Paul after the talk and, once I plied him with several large glasses of red wine, ask him to come and speak here in Assisi and to try and offer his framework to people involved in dialogue within and between churches, faiths, and between faith communities and their wider worlds. That phrase was a simple but immensely significant and very challenging one. Everyone who is part of the problem must be part of the solution. Paul is a veteran of numerous media contributions all around the world, especially in Ireland, Britain, and the United States. In 1997 to 98, he held a senior fellowship at the United States Institute of Peace in Washington, D.C., where his research was in Track 2 diplomacy. He was a Jefferson Smurfit Distinguished Fellow in Irish Studies at the University of Missouri in 2000, and for 6 months in 2007, he was Fulbright Scholar at Stanford University. Please join me in giving a very warm welcome to Professor Paul Arthur.
This is water, not wine. And the reason I did turn up a year early was that it was more than several glasses of wine, and Gerard's enthusiasm was so much that I felt that I had to become a pilgrim of hope as early as possible. I want to begin from a position of some humility. I'm genuinely delighted to be invited to a gathering like this. This is my first experience because I feel a bit of a fraud. I was born and raised as a Catholic in Northern Ireland, but I am not of a faith community for quite some time. And when I listened to people earlier speaking about their hopes, the path of hope, I suddenly realized that the novel I'm reading at the moment is by Shalom Auslander, and it's called Hope, the Tragedy. And the theme of the novel is an outrageous one. It's part of a Jewish conversation about the Holocaust and how the Holocaust has overcome us, and about the fact that this is a case where the narrator finds in his attic an 83-year-old Anne Frank, who has been hiding up in the attic all of these times. And it's a dialogue among the Jewish community about the Holocaust and all the rest of it. And the central theme that the narrator has to give comes from his mentor, who argues that the greatest evil in the world is hope. And he says, if you look at it, those who went into the world with the greatest hope were the Hitlers of this world, with the notion of the final solution. He says, firstly, the notion of solution in itself is dangerous, but the notion of a final solution is ultimately dangerous. Now, I give you that as an opening simply because I think it is important in discussions like this to be engaged in countervailing opinions, and you can't have much more countervailing opinion than that. I'm also very conscious that I am a person who knows a great deal about one particular conflict, and it is a conflict that has passed. And I retired about 18 months ago, and I've been doing quite a bit of teaching in different places. And when I was asked to put on a course, firstly in London and then to move on to Amman in Jordan, and the idea was to look at how you can solve conflict through the Northern Ireland conflict, and then to move to the Middle East to show the hopelessness of trying to solve conflict. And when we were discussing this with some of the American universities, their attitude was, we couldn't get any students to do that. Why not? Because Northern Ireland is ancient history. It was something which was solved 10 years ago, and therefore our students have moved on. And I realize that when I do speak to audiences, that It is something which has passed. Our moment of glory was when we were mired in violence and when the world's media couldn't leave us alone. And I remember at one particular moment in time when the two ancient enemies met and they embraced each other, one journalist turned around to another and he said, "That's that then. From now on, it's just going to be covering garden parties." So, you know, that violence does carry with it its own ethos. And it does carry with it its own rationale. And that will be one of my starting points. But I would really want to try and pick up some of the themes that we're going to be discussing over the next 3 or 4 days. So I'll begin with a health warning, and then with an event, and then with a metaphor. The health warning many of you will be aware of. It's Francis Bacon writing at the beginning of the 17th century when Europe was engrossed in religious wars. He says, "If we begin with certainties, we will end with doubt. But if we begin with doubts and bear them patiently, we may end with certainty." And I think that's a very good position to start with, because conflict is created by people who do begin with certainty. They know the answer, and it's the other who doesn't know the answer. And it's how to persuade the other that this is the only direction in which you can move. The event I want to recall were the first democratic elections in South Africa in 1994. And I don't want to recall them as a political scientist, as a social scientist, as a historian. I want to look at how it was seen through the eyes of a novelist. Because one of my big themes is that in the lessons for the quest of peace, there is much to be learnt from outside formal and informal diplomacy, and much to be learnt from the arts. And I see that more and more as I reflect on our own conflict. And it is Andre Brink, the novelist, who is writing about the first free elections in South Africa. He describes as a moment so brief and bright that it appeared all too easy afterwards to discount it as an illusion. But in the long course of history, there are the defining instants in the wind we live by. Without them, we must flounder. They keep us going, the dreams that ultimately justify the effort and disillusionment leading to renewed dedication, without which human progress is unthinkable. Those of us who stood on in the long queues on that April day to perform the simplest of actions imaginable, drawing a cross on a square. To perform the simplest of actions imaginable, drawing a cross on a square, will never forget the exhilaration in what the writer Njabulu Edebele has called the discovery of the ordinary. Nothing could have been more momentous than discovering that all of us, rich or poor, black or white, or anything in between, business executive or street sweeper, student or prostitute, were ultimately involved in and defined by this part of Africa. Just the act of the ordinary. And that is recorded by someone who's got the artistic eye to see the huge importance of what all of us take for granted, all of us who live in a liberal democratic world. And that was an extraordinary moment. And no matter how we judge South Africa at the moment, we have to recognize that it went through that, and we have to recognize that there are moments of light and of darkness, and it is how we bring them together in some way. The metaphor I want to borrow has already been mentioned as one of the themes of the dialogue over the next 4 days, and it is that of bridge building. And it comes from David Remnick's book on Barack Obama, and the title, of course, is The Bridge. And the bridge to which he alludes is the Edmund Pettus Bridge in Selma, Montgomery, when on the 7th of March, 1965, Martin Luther King led a group of civil rights activists who were trying to cross that bridge, 800 of them trying to cross that bridge on their way to Montgomery to celebrate the fact that civil rights had to come into being. And what happened was that they were attacked by the forces of law and order. They knelt down and they prayed on the spot, but they couldn't get over the bridge and they were blocked. And that story was captured in the news media that night. In fact, ABC were showing, appropriately enough, the film Judgment at Nuremberg. And 46 million people were watching it. And Judgment at Nuremberg was taken out so that people could see what had happened on that bridge. And as a result of that, you had the Voting Rights Act in the United States. And 3 weeks later, Martin Luther King, John Lewis, and 1,000 others crossed that bridge and made their journey. And when he got to Montgomery, I want to quote what he has to say, because it is about the power of rhetoric. The power of rhetoric can be uplifting. It can be both spirited and spiritual. And this is what he had to say. I know you are asking today, how long will it take? I come to say to you this afternoon, however difficult the moment, however frustrating the hour, it will not be long, because truth pressed to the earth will rise again. How long will it take? Not long, because no lie can live forever. How long? Not long, because you will reap what you will sow. How long? Not long, because the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice. Now that's biblical language into a secular world which has a huge impetus on people who are demanding freedom and want to move forward. And it captures what Martin Luther King elsewhere has spoken about, the inescapable network of mutuality. And also what Wilfred Owen refers to as the universal reciprocity of tears. That the human spirit can be moved in certain directions. It can be moved through leadership. It can be moved through symbolism. And I say all of that because what strikes me when I look at the relative success of transforming our conflict in Northern Ireland, what you move from is a society based on fatalism, a society without empathy. It's a society which has a very selective version of the past. It has little time for the present and no time for the future. It is mired in its own sense of self-grievance and no belief that there is any way out. And what a peace process can do is that it can remove people from that fatalism. And I think that is about the most important thing that can happen. It can show, again to quote Brink, that you can overcome disillusionment and ultimately you will overcome. And Martin Luther King served as a symbol for what we try to do in Northern Ireland. I was involved in the civil rights movement, which began in 1968, and we chose as our theme, "We shall overcome." We had to move away from the symbols of Ireland, and so "We shall overcome" became, if you like, our anthem. We also were conscious about the symbol of a bridge can be both a positive and a negative. This community, over the next couple of days, is speaking of bridge building as being a positive. But that very expression, bridge building, was used by a Liberal Prime Minister of Northern Ireland in the middle 1960s when he wanted to move towards some more liberal regime. And he talked about building bridges. And his arch opponent came out with this epithet. He said, "What does a bridge and a traitor have in common? Both cross to the other side." And it was a powerful piece of rhetoric. So rhetoric can, of course, be used in both ways. And yet the man who used that expression, and was using the expression as late as 2005, 2 years later, had gone into government with his most detested enemy. And in 2008, he sat down with the former Chief of Staff of the Irish Republican Army as his deputy. So that has to tell us something about how we possibly can move on. So the bridge is a metaphor both of hope, but also as a warning for those who don't believe in hope. And what that coming together of these two ancient enemies is really about the process of productive reassessment. Because my contention is that in a peace process, the life cycle of a conflict, and that is if the conflict comes out on the right side, it goes through three separate phases: analysis, negotiation, implementation. And the analysis and the negotiation might be the easy part, and implementation can well be the hardest. Because if you look at the history of peace agreements and look at the success of peace agreements, they are remarkably few. I think one assessment is that no more than about 20% go beyond 5 years. So I'll want to come on to that. So we begin really with the whole question of analysis. And my basic point is that in my society, we were, as I've said, a society without empathy. We had got no culture of dialogue whatsoever. We literally didn't talk to each other. We talked at each other. If you look at the history of the parliamentary democracy in my part of the world, from 1921 until the mid-1960s, there was no dialogue. The opposition didn't attend Parliament, didn't take the role of being official opposition, came along as sort of ombudsman of grievances for the Catholic community, and that was the height of it. The party in government said, we are a democratic government. We've been elected by a majority of the people. We have fulfilled all the criteria of what is expected of liberal democracies, and therefore we can do whatsoever we like. And so in a culture like that, moving to dialogue can be incredibly difficult. And it can take a very long time. But it raises a lesson for trying to solve conflicts elsewhere, and the Middle East is a classic example. And that is that governments or negotiators starting with having no cognitive framework are perhaps in a better position than having a wrong cognitive framework, which is what happens when you prematurely close in on an understanding. That is, when you start with certainty. You believe you've got the understanding. You believe you know what the outcome is. It's a question of how you get to that outcome. So having no cognitive framework may be better than having a wrong one. There are no correct understandings, but there are very bad ones. And so, in our particular context, we had to get to grips with a political culture which I have described elsewhere as being demotic, factionalized, intimidatory, and underdeveloped, and in a society which operated in conditions of frozen violence. The violence was frozen in 1920 when there appeared to be a settlement in Ireland. And once people began to demand rights under their notion of what a democratic outcome should be, then you had the freezing or the unfreezing of that violence, which led, in a very short time, to something like 3,700 deaths in a territory no larger than that of Rhode Island, a population of 1.5 million people. The equivalent in the United States, if the same had happened in the United States, would have been 500,000 people dead through civil society. So this was a very ruthless, but also a very intimate conflict. We were killing our neighbors. We often knew, and again, this is one of the lessons that we need to think about in coming out of conflict is this major question of how do you deal with the past? And again, I hope to come to that. And so, when the conflict began, there were two opposing opinions. One was that we will overcome. The righteousness of our cause cannot be questioned. Another was that we are fulfilling the democratic criteria that is expected of any Western liberal democracy, and these people are essentially terrorists. So there was we were filled with a huge degree of self-righteousness on both sides. And it brings to mind, and this is again why I return to the arts, it brings to mind a expression I picked up from the literary critic Lionel Trilling. He said that unless we insist that politics is imagination and mind, we will learn that imagination and mind are politics, and of a kind that we will not like. So the degree to which politics can be pushed in the degree to which politics is about passion rather than reason, and we can push people in a certain way through the use of symbolism, I think becomes very important. And one of our leading intellectuals, a man called Conor Cruise O'Brien, makes the point. He said, man's political life is more intimately an expression of the general quality of his imaginative life than we are in the habit of noticing. And those who are concerned with man's imaginative life are therefore concerned with the area in which his political concepts are shaped. They don't shape themselves, but are shaped in his imagination not only by man's mortal destiny and the metaphysical questions to which it gave rise, but also by the particular contexts of nation, doctrine, class, and race. So he says the study of politics must neither neglect the fact that man is an imagining and myth-making animal, nor fail to make explicit allowances for the necessary entry of imagination and myth-making into the study itself. I raise that because much of the violence in my part of the world, and you're seeing it in the present day in Israel and Palestine, and you'll have seen it in other parts, you've seen it in Rwanda and elsewhere, is the way you can move people's imaginations to the most destructive things that anyone can think of. So it is something that we need to bear in mind, and we need to deal with it in an imaginary way. Another point I think that we need to bear in mind when we deal with the whole question of analysis is a question of a lack of dialogue. Northern Ireland, from 1920 until the outbreak of the Troubles in 1968, enjoyed a period of what is called a tranquility of communal deterrence. A tranquility of communal deterrence. That is, we each knew what damage we could do to the other, so we held back. And that is the frozen violence. But once that's unfrozen, it can take dreadful consequences. And so what it did was it displayed a lack of self-reflection and inability to engage in dialogue. And I want to give one explanation of the importance of dialogue from a political philosopher. He says, it is ideally via dialogue that we become clear who we are, that we express what is important to us, that we check out the intelligibility and the appropriateness of our goals and purposes, and so forth. Dialogue is the vehicle par excellence of the search for authentic self-interpretation, not least because it is constituted by relations of reciprocity and recognition. Such relations are so important because their absence goes a long way towards explaining why individually and collectively we often find ourselves struggling with frustrating self-interpretations, perhaps ones that demean us. The two key words in that are reciprocity, recognition. You cannot have one without the other, and you cannot have either without engaging in dialogue. And so, establishing relations of reciprocity and recognition becomes very important, and I want to look at some ways in which that can be done. Where you don't have dialogue at the formal political level, you look at the informal. Gerard spoke about track 1 and track 2 diplomacy. Academics are quite fond of being as obfuscatory as possible. It's often how we make our careers. And one has now come up with the fact that there are 9 tracks of diplomacy. I'm not going to bore you with going through the 9. And I am taken very much by the notion of track 1.5. In fact, after about 10 years of being involved in track 2 diplomacy, and I interviewed many of the politicians who had taken part in quite a few of the exercises, what they were saying was, we are moving towards track 1.5, and this was being said more than a decade ago. A realization that, in fact, official and unofficial has to work some way together, that they're not parallel tracks. So we need to look at ways whereby we can engage outside the formal political processes. And I've given you some statistics on violence in Northern Ireland. But one of the points I think which is worthwhile bearing in mind, as bad as the violence was, Belfast never did become Beirut. And one of the reasons why Belfast never did, if you look at the statistics of violence in Lebanon once the civil war broke down, or if you look at places like Rwanda and Burundi and see the incredible intensity of the violence in very short periods, we never were engaged in that. And one historian doing a longitudinal study of violence comes up with quite an unusual explanation. And he argues that we have been at it for so long. We've been at it, he said, from about the 1800s onwards, that we were genetically encoded to know when to stop. You know, I could hit you, you could hit back, and then we begin to realize that this is self-defeating. And I could give so many examples from our troubles where when it looked as if we were going over the abyss, we suddenly pulled back. And this is the notion of genetically encoded reasons for not getting engaged in violence. And so it raises the question about civil society. That whereas politicians were using a rhetoric which was about enmity, civil society was recognizing that they did have to work together. And one of the earliest versions of good ecumenical practice in Northern Ireland was a group called the Coromila Community, which was established before the Troubles broke out, established by a Presbyterian, about 1963, Presbyterian minister who realized that this Cold War between the major religious groups could possibly lead to serious violence. And he chose a lovely isolated spot on the coast, which was meant to be a gathering point to bring people together. And there were lots of groups like that. At the height of the Troubles, when politicians couldn't be seen talking together, there was a little oasis in the centre of Belfast called Quaker House, where the Quakers were able to bring people together. Or when women and children trying to visit their men in jail who were there for political crimes, it was the Quakers who supplied the transport to get them there and supplied them with the tea and the comforts that they needed. So even when times were really bad, there were groups who were doing things. It is not about the big picture. It is about the small picture. And I think this is encapsulated brilliantly by one of our Nobel laureates. I mean, one of the paradoxes of political violence is that a place the size of Northern Ireland, as I say, 1.5 to 1.7 million, produced 4 Nobel laureates in the space of 20 years. Sorry, 5. 5 Nobel laureates. The Peace People in 1976, the 2 women who tried to move things forward, Mairead Corrigan and
forget her first name, Betty Williams, exactly. And then in 1998, John Hume and David Trimble. But in between, Seamus Heaney for poetry. And I would encourage anyone who's seriously interested, well, this is silly saying it to this audience, but I would encourage you to read Heaney's Nobel lecture. It's called Crediting Poetry. And it is about the role that art can play in bringing people together. And I want to quote from Heaney to try and demonstrate that, again, in the analytical phase, one of the things that we need to take into account is the role of transcendence. Transcendence has been described as the art of bringing together what violence has severed. And Heaney uses an example from the worst days of the Troubles in January of 1976, when workmen are coming home after a day's work. It's the middle of the winter, it's very dark. There appears to be some sort of blockage in front of them. They're stopped. They're taken out of their van, and they're put up against a wall in an isolated country spot. And they're faced with men with masks and guns. And one of the men with the gun said, "Are there any Catholics among you?" So the assumption was that they were out to kill Catholics. And I want to put this into some sort of context. He mused on the fact that only the very stupid or the very deprived can any longer help knowing that the documents of civilization have been written in blood and tears. Blood and tears no less real for being very remote. And when this intellectual predisposition coexists with actualities of Ulster and Israel and Bosnia and Rwanda and a host of other wounded spots on the face of the earth, the inclination is not only to credit human nature with much constructive potential, but not to credit anything too positive in the work of art. And Heaney muses on the role of art, and muses on the role of someone like himself as a poet. And some of his poetry is about this, how he seemed to be sitting quietly by his desk when people around him were being killed. And he raises the question of what is the role of the artist in conflict. And he decided that, in fact, art can rise to the occasion. So he describes what happens when the Catholics in the group are asked to move. He said it was a terrible moment for him, caught between dread and witness. But he did make a motion, because there only was one Catholic in the 10 workmen. He did make a motion to step forward. Then, the story goes, in that split second of decision and in the relative cover of the winter evening darkness, he felt the hand of the Protestant worker next to him take his hand and squeeze it in a signal that said, "No, do not move. We will not betray you. Nobody needs to know what faith or party you belong to." All in vain, however, for the man stepped out of line, but instead of finding a gun at his temple, he was pushed away as the gunmen opened fire on those remaining in the line, for those were not Protestant terrorists, but members, presumably, of the Provisional IRA. Now, having told the story, he reflected that it is difficult at times to repress the thought that history is about as instructive as an abattoir, that Tacitus was right, and that peace is merely the desolation left behind after the decisive operation. But then he carried that through with a sort of moment of light. He said, "The birth of the future we desire is surely in the contraction which that terrified Catholic felt on the roadside when another hand gripped his hand, not in the gunfire that followed, so absolute and so desolate. It is almost so much a part of the music of what happens." So the analysis is about taking into consideration the role that civic society can play, the role that individuals can play, the symbolism of the transcendent. And I can give you many other examples, but the point about these actions is that they don't receive
any publicity. And yet they are a major part of what becomes known as a peace process. And it is, again, the extraordinary about the ordinary. It is about the light and the darkness, and it is about how the light can come out of the darkness. That, if you like, is the role played by the ordinary. If you look at the official histories of the conflict, what we learn from the analytical phase is that so many mistakes were made because we always had premature understandings of what the answer was to be about. But if you're seriously engaged in a peace process, and this is one of the reasons why I would remain hopeful for places such as the Middle East, is that because you know that there are in those areas people working night and day for peace. I have a huge sympathy, for example, with the Palestinian cause. I lived for a year in Israel on a kibbutz a long time ago. Hebrew was the only language I could speak outside English at one stage. And so I have some sympathy for Israelis. And when I visit both Israel and Palestine, and I see the terrible damage being done to Palestinians by official Israeli policy, and I see the damage that the Palestinian Authority was doing in places like Gaza and the West Bank through corruption and other ways, you begin to despair. But then you meet individuals on both sides. And as an academic, for example, I am totally opposed to an academic boycott of Israel, no matter what the official government policy is, because I know there are people in those communities working all the time to make sure that that dialogue continues. And it is these people that you have to work through and work with. And so you have, at one stage, a realization that official policy is taking you down a road of destruction. At the other, you have the realization that the spirit that Martin Luther King spoke about is a spirit which is imbued with many people, and that has to be followed through. So what happened in our particular conflict, oh sorry, I hadn't realized the time. Well, what happened in our particular conflict is that we began to realize that we started with the wrong cognitive framework. That this was not simply a conflict between Catholic and Protestant in a small part of territory on the island of Ireland. This was a much bigger historical conflict, which involved both Britain and Ireland. So it wasn't a Northern Ireland problem, it was a British-Irish problem. It wasn't a problem simply about two particular communities, Catholic and Protestant, Loyalist and Republican, Unionist and Nationalist. It was about an historic injustice that needed to be addressed. And so we had to deal with all of this. And we had to broaden the base from not two parties, but to at least four parties. To the parties inside Northern Ireland. Oh, right. Well, that's too much time. To the parties inside Northern Ireland and the two governments. And so we moved from this notion that we need to remove it from the parties inside Northern Ireland and get the governments involved. And then we had to take it a stage further to realize that because it was a conflict where there was a deep sense of historic injustice, and where much of the passions about the conflict were passions which were held particularly among the diaspora in the South Bronx or South Boston or the Bronx or whatever, that the diaspora needed to be engaged in a constructive way. And so we began to internationalize the conflict in a positive, constructive way. And we began to engage the United States administration. And I'm always very conscious when I'm speaking to audiences in the Middle East, when I begin to sing the praises of the United States, I've immediately lost at least half my audience. But the Irish conflict is one of the huge success stories of United States diplomacy that hasn't fully been written up yet, but it really has played a huge role. And we began to engage with others. through Track 2 diplomacy, for example, I took a group to South Africa in 1994. The South Africans wanted to show us what they were capable of doing. And the South Africans were a wonderful role model for us because of the ANC on one side and the National Party on the other. The IRA admired greatly the role of the ANC. The IRA saw itself as being a part of a nexus of ANC, PLO, IRA. The unionist community identified entirely with the National Party. And we were able to get individuals from both those parties to address their respective audiences in Northern Ireland. And so someone like Rolf Mayer, who negotiated an agreement on the part of the National Party, was able to persuade unionists in Northern Ireland that there was a need for a paradigm shift. So taking it away from the narrow ground of the conflict in itself begins to liberate people. It begins to show them that, in fact, there are many ways of looking at things. And you may learn lessons from others, and you may be able to shuffle off your fatalism. So that became another part of constructing the framework for a settlement. And the final part comes in what Gerard mentioned in his introduction, that everybody has to be part of the solution, that you have to engage with the enemy. My position as someone who'd grown up in the bog side in a Republican area, grown up with many people who joined the IRA, but grown up as someone who had always had a pacifist background, my position was that I could never support these people, that I may well have desired the same end as they wanted, which was a united Ireland, but I disapproved fundamentally with the means whereby they hoped to get a united Ireland. So I would not have been in touch with any of people I had literally grown up with. Former chief of the IRA was a younger neighbour of mine. I knew him well. And yet I hadn't spoken to him for 30 years until I began to get engaged in Track 2. And when I did go and talk to him, it was as if we'd been talking every day of the week for those 40 years, because they wanted a way out. They needed some sort of way out. And that will bring me in a few moments to the role of leadership. So it is trying to find the conditions whereby people realize that there is an alternative. And I could bore you again with going through all the shifts made on the Republican side. But there were fundamental shifts made. And once they were shown that there was a way out in which they could come out with dignity and also with the aspiration of achieving what they'd been fighting for all their lives, but accepting the fundamental notion of consent, that they could only persuade people of the way forward was through consent. Once they had reached that point, then everything became possible. So you move then from the analysis, which is now accepting who are the parties to the problem, now accepting that there are a couple of fundamental constructs in that, and one of the constructs being the notion, the essential construct being the notion of the doctrine of consent. Once you begin to move in that direction, you're then moving into the negotiation phase. Now, in a conflict as intense as ours, building trust clearly wasn't going to be easy. And this is where I think Track 2 really did have a role to play. Track 2, it seems to me, did two essential things. One was it began to humanize the enemy. If you got people into the same room, away from the center of the conflict, we always held our meetings in the United States, or in France, or in South Africa, never in Northern Ireland. You cannot hope to have successful meetings when a conflict is raging. We always were in a place where there was no media present, the media knew nothing about it, where we'd built in a good deal of leisure time, where we'd offered people places to meet in common if they so wished, or if they didn't, they could go their different ways. I remember we held a meeting in Grenoble in France. And for those of you who will know, Grenoble isn't that very far from Geneva. And at a certain stage during our discussions, it was becoming fairly intense. And one party, the Democratic Unionist Party, a party of fundamentalist Protestants, asked for the afternoon off because they wanted to go to Geneva, to the birthplace of Calvin. And you agree to that. And the atmosphere changes. And you can't do this in formal negotiation. And it is recognized that you have made an effort, and the other parties there have made an effort to allow this to happen. And in leisure time, I can remember so many meetings. Once we'd build up a sort of cadre of familiar figures, and what we tried to do was we tried to identify those whom we thought were going to be there when negotiations did break out. We started, despite what I said at the very beginning about hope being tragedy, we started with the belief that there had to be an end to the conflict, and therefore we had to be ready for the end to that conflict. And once you get the same number of people meeting, and they are breaking bread together, some with wine and some not with wine, which was a bit of a difficulty. But once you get them, and they start to tell stories about their families, and they start to share stories about their children. And all of this can create conditions where they begin to know the other person, not as an enemy, but as another human being. I'll just give one other instance of this. It was a meeting we held in Salzburg Seminar, where one of the points about track 2 is that it has to be totally transparent. You have to say to people what the agenda is. You're not going to deviate from that agenda. If the parties want to deviate, that's their right. You have to say precisely who's going to be there. You don't attempt to introduce any foreign bodies. You have to do all of this. And when I was asked to bring some people from Northern Ireland to a session in Salzburg, I went to a unionist and said, I'm inviting someone from Sinn Féin. Sinn Féin being the political wing of the IRA, to which he said, that's fine. You can invite whomsoever you like. I will not talk to that individual. I will have nothing to do with that individual. I won't shake his hands. I may be in the same room with him. I will make my party peace. He will make his party peace, but never the twain shall meet. So that was the agreement. And they didn't speak until we organized a session on the nature of political violence. It actually was the nature of domestic violence, and we got an academic who had specialized in domestic violence, but also was the leader of the Women's Coalition in Northern Ireland. So she was both politician and an academic. And she began to speak about violence. And when she had spoken, it was an after-dinner affair, the person from Sinn Féin got up and spoke. And he spoke incredibly movingly when he talked about the impact of violence in his own family. And he talked about his son, who had gone out as a member of the IRA to ambush a British Army contingent. But they in turn were ambushed, and his son was killed. And he spoke most movingly about the fact that there wasn't a day in his life when he didn't think of the impact of political violence on his family, and therefore on the impact of political violence on the wider community. It was an incredibly moving, transcendent moment. As a result of that, the unionist who said he would not even shake his hands got up and spoke about the impact of political violence on his family, where many members of his family had been killed by the IRA because they'd been engaged with the security forces. And that was a breakthrough point. They began to enter into dialogue, and they talked passionately for 3 or 4 hours. And this is long before there are formal peace talks. And that's when you know that there are real possibilities of breakthrough. And that can only, I think, be done through the unofficial. Because the official is about trying to find solutions. The unofficial is never dealing with final status issues. It is about giving people space to explore as wide an agenda as they like. It is about making them feel comfortable with each other. It's about getting them to feed back into their communities the lessons that they have learned. And that feeds into the negotiation phase. Because when we did get into negotiation, it was very many of the same parties who were involved in that negotiation. And they knew each other and were happy to deal with each other. And so it raises questions about the nature of political leadership. I think that one of the most brilliant things I've read on politics is Max Weber's very famous lecture when he speaks about leaderships. And he talks about politics. He says, politics is made with the head, and yet devotion to politics can be born and nourished from passion alone. For Weber, that passion had to be informed by what he calls an ethic of responsibility, a willingness to accept responsibility for the consequences of one's actions in an imperfect world. And towards the end of his lecture, he celebrates this kind of politics in a passage that connects very directly with some of the things that I have seen in the process. He quotes a resonant phrase first uttered by Martin Luther. He said, "It is immensely moving when a man is aware of a responsibility for the consequences of his conduct and really feels such responsibility with heart and soul. He then acts by following an ethic of responsibility. And somewhere he reaches the point where he says, 'Here I stand, I can do no other.' That is something genuinely human and moving. And it is when you get political leaders to get to that particular point. So even though I have been singing the praises, if you like, of civil society, I also have to recognize the efforts made by political leaders. When John Hume and David Trimble were awarded the Nobel Prize, Senator George Mitchell, who played a central role in getting us to the point of an agreement, said that there would have been no peace process without John Hume. He'd been struggling with it for over 30 years. No peace process without him, and no peace agreement without David Trimble. Because it was Trimble who made had the huge moral courage to make that leap of faith, to recognize that you were in a different paradigm and that you had to move in that, and realize that he could lose most of his audience, most of his constituency. And that, in fact, is what happened. Because when you get to a peace agreement, you have simply reached a plateau. You have simply reached a point where there's a certain amount of agreement on a certain number of issues, and for the most part, all the difficult issues have been sidelined. And that's where implementation comes into play. So you have to be realistic about peace agreements. Robert Rothstein, who studied peace agreements, says that it moves you on to a completely different set of circumstances, where leaders have to reform and revision, where they have to be aware that the behavior that got them to the point of agreement is behavior which is not appropriate to getting beyond agreement, because it's not simply about serving your own constituency, it is now about the wider constituency. And so you're into a position where leaders really have to use all the powers that they have to allow that to happen. They really have to, if they have genuine leadership qualities, they have to do the famous Rabin, not Arafat, Sadat moment. They have to make that leap, or was it? We know, anyway, the Egyptian president and the Israeli prime minister, I don't think it was, in fact it was Menachem Begin, that you have to realize that you have to make that huge paradigm shift, and you have to have the confidence to have the belief that you can bring your constituency with you, or at least enough of your constituency. And for groups such as former paramilitaries, terrorists, freedom fighters, call them what you will, they have to believe that they have the capacity to bring their leaders along with them. So if you look at the negotiating phase, what happens is that in December of 1993, the British Prime Minister and Irish Prime Minister produced a document known as the Downing Street Declaration, which is one of the most grotesque pieces of English ever written in the history of mankind. It had to be grotesque because it was trying to do the impossible. It was trying to persuade the IRA that they could win and persuade loyalists that the IRA had lost. And so it came up with a form of language which was so grotesque that it won the prize for the worst piece of official English for the year 1993. And the architects of that would have been very proud of having won that prize because they knew precisely what they were doing. They were trying to produce something which would allow the parties to move forward. And as a result of that, in 1994, 31st of August 1994, and then the 13th of October 1994, the two sets of paramilitaries signed up to cessations of violence. They were to break down in 1996 because of mistrust. They are restored, and then they come into play with the creation of a Labour government in 1997 and an agreement in 1998. The agreement left many of the most difficult issues. The whole question of decommissioning of weapons, the whole nature of the official security apparatus, the question of not only decommissioning but disarmament, the questions of an equity agenda, of a human rights agenda. All of that were issues that were to be settled over the next 10 years. And they were settled because we moved away from the language of confrontation to the language of management, to realizing that peace comes in pieces, that you take one issue at a time and you build it up incrementally. And as you're building it up incrementally, you're also building up trust. And out of that trust, you build up a belief that fatalism belongs to the past, and you moved into a new dispensation. And it is for that reason that though I started with a quote from, or a mention of a novel about hope and tragedy, I want to finish with a quote, if I can find it, and it comes appropriately enough to this audience from Dietrich Bonhoeffer. He says, "The essence of optimism is that it takes no account of the present, but it is a source of inspiration, of vitality and hope where others have resigned. It enabled a man to hold his head high, to claim the future for himself." So by taking no account of the present, but by thinking of the future, and thinking that while there are many moments of darkness, there are those transcendences, there are those light moments, which is what gives you hope to continue. And that's the way forward. Thank you. Thanks, Eric. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Paul, for a wonderful opening plenary lecture for our conference. We are ahead of time, but I think you've all been very patient and sitting down, and what we'll do is take a little breather time before dinner, and it will enable us all to be in dinner on time. We've had a wonderful start to our gathering. We've had some wonderful stimulation from Paul and from all of the other people who have spoke this afternoon. I hope, like me, you're looking forward to talking about the things we've heard and stimulating further conversation well into the evening later on. At various points of our gathering, we'll be doing small housekeeping moments as rooms change, or the names of rooms change, as happened in one or two instances, and also about various practical matters. I think at this point, the main practical matter to ask you to remember is that we have some lists for people who want to share taxis back to Rome together on Saturday morning. Essentially, the more people in a taxi, the cheaper it will be for you. So there are various times and 2 locations, Fiumicino Airport and Termini train station, right outside here. So we encourage you to sign up as early as you can, and then people can see who they're travelling with. Not so that they can sort of get out of the car, but so they can have a conversation with those people along the way and implement some of the process points that Paul has shared with us this evening. I'm looking at my colleagues on the committee to see if there are any other housekeeping points at this moment in time. And they're looking at me blank. So, dinner time is 7:45. Dinner is downstairs, not where breakfast was, not where lunch was, but in the main, largest restaurant down there. Follow the central staircase and go down there, and it's the largest room in the basement floor, -1 if you take the elevator. So thank you very much. The soul food will take place here this evening, just to remind you. So we return here after dinner at 10 p.m. It's very short, and all of our souls need food. So once you've nourished your bellies, we can nourish our souls. But just before we depart, please join me once again in thanking Paul and all of our speakers this afternoon. Thank you very much. Paul.
I can't smile.